The afternoon had been ordinary in every way that preceded catastrophe. Sarah Martinez stood in her kitchen on Maple Street in Columbus, Ohio, preparing dinner while her 3 daughters played in the living room. The smell of tomatoes and garlic simmered on the stove, filling the modest but well-kept home with warmth. Outside, a gray March sky threatened rain, and the first drops began to fall against the windows. Sarah hummed softly, mentally running through her evening, homework with the girls, bath time, bed by 9. Routine, predictable, safe. Emma, her eldest at 8 years old, sat cross-legged on the living room carpet with her younger sisters, and Emma was supposed to be watching them while their mother prepared dinner, a responsibility she took seriously. She was a thoughtful child, mature for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She'd been reading too from a picture book when the sound of rain intensified, and she'd wandered to the window, drawn by the rhythm of it against the glass. The street outside was quiet, lined with suburban homes that had seen better days but held the dignity of working families who cared for their properties. Neighbors walked their dogs occasionally. Children played basketball in driveways. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever happened, where life unfolded in predictable, manageable pieces. Emma pressed her face closer to the window pane, watching the raindrops race down the glass. She was thinking about her science project due Friday, about how she wanted to build a volcano model, when she noticed the car. It came from the direction of 10th Street, moving faster than normal traffic. Even from inside the house, behind the glass and rain, Emma could sense something wrong about the speed. The red sedan was weaving slightly, almost playfully, as if the driver was testing the limits of the wet pavement. Emma's 8-year-old mind registered a vague unease. She'd been raised to notice things, to be aware. Her mother had always emphasized safety consciousness. The cyclist came into view moments later, pedaling home from his job at the nearby office complex. He was in his mid-30s, a man named David who'd been biking to work for 3 years to stay healthy and reduce his carbon footprint. He wore a fluorescent yellow jacket and had lights on both his bike's front and rear. He was following all the rules, doing everything right. He had no idea what was about to happen. The red sedan didn't slow down. Emma's eyes widened as she watched the vehicle accelerate toward the cyclist. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Maybe the driver hadn't seen him, maybe it would swerve. Cars swerved. People reacted. This was how accidents were avoided. But this driver didn't swerve. Instead, the sedan seemed to angle directly toward the man on the bicycle, as if guided by intent rather than accident. The collision happened in less than a second, but to Emma, time seemed to stretch and distort. The impact was catastrophic in its violence. The cyclist's body flew over the hood of the car like a rag doll, his bicycle crumpling beneath the wheels. His body crashed onto the pavement with a sound that Emma would hear in her nightmares for years to come. A wet, heavy, sickening thud that echoed through the rain-soaked street. Emma screamed. Her scream was piercing and primal, the sound of a child witnessing something that shattered her sense of safety. It was the scream of innocence breaking, and ran to her immediately, confused and frightened by their sister's terror. They pressed against her small body, not understanding what had happened, but understanding that something terrible had occurred. Sarah came running from the kitchen, her hands still wet with tomato sauce, her face already twisted in alarm. Emma, what's wrong? What happened?" She knelt beside her daughter, searching her face for injury, for some sign of physical harm that would explain such anguish. But Emma couldn't answer, she could only point. Sarah followed her daughter's trembling finger to the window and saw him, the cyclist, lying motionless on the rain-soaked pavement. The red sedan was already accelerating away, disappearing around the corner with a spray of water from its tires. For a moment, Sarah froze, her mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. Then instinct took over. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she reported the accident. She told the dispatcher the location, described the cyclist's condition, and mentioned the red sedan. She tried to provide a license plate, but the car had turned the corner too quickly. She could only remember partial numbers, something like 74 or 75, maybe an A. The dispatcher assured her help was on the way and urged her to stay on the line. Within minutes, sirens wailed through the neighborhood. Police cars arrived first, followed by an ambulance. Sarah held her daughter's clothes, keeping them away from the window, but Emma had already seen too much. The cyclist's body remained on the cold pavement for what felt like forever but was probably only minutes. Paramedics worked on him urgently, assessing injuries, preparing to transport. The man had regained consciousness, groaning in pain, and that small sign of life gave Sarah some measure of hope. He was alive. Alive meant he could recover. Officer James arrived on the scene in his patrol car, his K-9 partner Duke sitting alert in the specialized compartment behind him. Duke was a 2-year-old German Shepherd, trained in accident reconstruction and evidence tracking. He was an exceptionally intuitive dog, responsive to his handler's subtle cues and genuinely interested in his work. As Officer exited his vehicle and surveyed the scene, Duke waited patiently, knowing his time would come if needed. Sarah watched from her doorway as the police secured the scene. An officer approached her house, and she invited him inside, away from the rain. Emma was taken aside gently by a trained victim advocate who specialized in interviewing children. The officer asked her to describe what she'd seen, speaking in calm, measured tones designed not to further traumatize the child. Emma's words came haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. She described the red sedan, its reckless speed, the deliberate angle of approach. She described the collision with a child's brutal honesty, detailing what she'd witnessed without the filters adults use to soften trauma. The officer took notes, his expression growing more serious as Emma spoke. She mentioned the partial license plate, those numbers she'd glimpsed in her terror, 74, maybe 75, possibly an A. "You did very well, Emma," the officer told her, his voice warm but his mind already calculating next steps. "You're very observant and very brave. You've helped us a lot today." But Emma didn't feel brave. She felt shattered. She felt as though something fundamental about her understanding of the world had cracked wide open. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the scene clean, but Emma knew that nothing would ever wash away what she'd witnessed that Tuesday evening. The red sedan had driven away, leaving behind more than an injured cyclist. It had left behind a child's lost innocence, a community's shattered sense of safety, and the beginning of a mystery that would twist and turn in ways no one could have predicted. The cyclist, David, would recover from his physical injuries, though it would take months. But the real consequences of that accident were just beginning to unfold. The partial license plate Emma had provided would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to a wrongful accusation, a broken family, a corrupted investigation, and ultimately, a trial that would shake the entire community. But that Tuesday evening, as the rain fell and the sirens wailed, Emma simply held her mother and cried, unable to explain why the world suddenly felt so dangerous, so unpredictable, so terrifyingly wrong. The police investigation into the hit-and-run moved quickly. Officer James compiled Emma's statement carefully, documenting every detail the 8-year-old could remember. The partial license plate 74 or 75, possibly an A, became the starting point. The vehicle was described as a red sedan, mid-sized, possibly or. 1,000 vehicles matching that description existed in the greater Columbus area. Detective took over the case. He was a detective with 15 years on the force, known for his ability to close cases quickly. The department had been criticized lately for having too many open investigations and not enough solved ones. There was pressure from above to show results, to demonstrate competence and efficiency. Was ambitious. He wanted promotions. He wanted recognition. And he had a particular skill. The ability to identify patterns and build narratives that connected disparate pieces of evidence into compelling stories. On day 4 of the investigation, a breakthrough came. A traffic camera on Interstate 71 had captured a red sedan matching the description traveling toward the suburbs at approximately the time of the accident. The license plate was partially visible, pulled the plate number and ran it through the system. Michael Torres. The name pulled up immediately. Michael was 36 years old, worked as a construction manager, and lived just 3 miles from where the accident occurred. He drove a 2015 Accord Red. The match was close enough to be promising. Ran a background check. Michael had a few speeding tickets over the years, nothing serious but something. He had a previous DUI from 8 years ago, which had been expunged from his record but still showed in investigative databases. That detail stuck in his mind. Someone who'd driven drunk before might drive recklessly. The narrative was beginning to form. What didn't notice, or didn't care to investigate, was that Michael had been steadily employed for the past 8 years, had completed an alcohol counseling program, and by all available records, had transformed his life. His DUI was ancient history, but it fit the story was constructing. Michael Torres had no idea his life was about to shatter. He woke that morning as he did every morning. Alarm at 6:30, shower, coffee, review of the construction project he was managing downtown. He was proud of his work. It was honest work, skilled work that required attention to detail and responsibility for others' safety. He'd built a stable life after his mistakes in his 20s. He had a good relationship with his ex-wife Sarah, co-parenting their daughters with respect and consistency. He paid child support on time, every time. He saw the girls on weekends and was involved in their lives. By any measure, Michael had become a good man. At 8:15 that morning, Michael was at his office, reviewing blueprints with his team. His workplace was downtown, a 15-minute drive from his apartment. He was alone from 12 to 1 during his lunch break. He usually ate at his desk, working through lunch to catch up on paperwork. This was his routine almost every day. He never went out during lunch. He stayed focused on work. The knock on his apartment door came at 3:30 that afternoon. Michael wasn't home, so the police officers waited. When he arrived home at 5:15, fresh from work, they were standing there. The encounter was polite but firm. Michael was asked to step outside. He, confused, thinking perhaps there had been an accident involving one of his vehicles or maybe a problem at the construction site. Michael Torres, one of the officers asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes, that's me. Is something wrong?" "We have a warrant for your arrest related to a hit-and-run accident that occurred on March 19th at approximately 3:20 p.m. on Maple Street." The world tilted. Michael's stomach dropped. "What? No, I wasn't anywhere near Maple Street. I was at work. I'm always at work during the day." But the officers were already reading him his rights, already placing handcuffs on his wrists. Michael didn't resist. He was shocked, confused, but not frightened, not yet. He was innocent. There was clearly a mistake. It would be cleared up quickly. He cooperated fully, asked for a lawyer, and was transported to the precinct. Detective was waiting when Michael arrived at the station. The detective had a file prepared, documents spread across his desk that told a very specific story. The traffic camera footage. Michael's vehicle registration matching a red sedan. The DUI from 8 years ago. The previous speeding tickets. It was all arranged like a prosecutor's presentation, not like an open investigation seeking truth. "Your car was captured on traffic cameras heading away from the accident scene," said flatly, not bothering with preamble. "That's impossible," Michael said. "I was at work. My office is on High Street. Check with my employer. They have security footage. I was there the entire day." Made a note but didn't seem particularly interested. "We'll look into that. But your vehicle matches the description given by the witness. You have a history of reckless driving behavior. You were in the general area at the approximate time." "I don't have a history of reckless driving," Michael protested. "I have a couple of speeding tickets from years ago and one DUI when I was in my 20s. I've been clean since then. Check my record. Check my workplace. I go to work, I do my job, I see my daughters on weekends. I don't drive recklessly. Wasn't listening. He was building his case, not investigating it. He'd already decided Michael's guilt. The lawyer that Michael's employer provided, a public defender named Daniel Richards, was inexperienced and overworked. Richards had 300 active cases. He spent 40 minutes reviewing Michael's situation before the bail hearing. It was 40 minutes he didn't have to spare. Sarah learned about the arrest from the police. They came to her house to ask questions about Michael. She was devastated. Michael had many flaws. He'd been unfaithful during their marriage, he'd struggled with alcohol, but he'd genuinely changed. She'd watched him rebuild himself. He was devoted to his daughters. She couldn't imagine him doing what police were describing. The bail hearing was scheduled for the next day. Sarah attended, sitting in the public gallery. When Michael was brought in, still in the clothes he'd been wearing when arrested, he looked like a ghost. His eyes found hers immediately, desperate, confused. She nodded at him, trying to communicate support across the courtroom divide. The prosecutor presented the case in stark terms: matching vehicle, witness identification, history of reckless behavior. They requested bail be set high, arguing that someone with a prior DUI represented a public safety risk. Michael's lawyer presented the counterargument weakly. He mentioned Michael's stable employment and ties to the community, but there was no passion, no conviction in his words. He hadn't had time to investigate properly. He hadn't reviewed the workplace security footage. He hadn't interviewed Michaels to establish his alibi. The judge set bail at $30,000. Michael didn't have that kind of money liquid. His employer wasn't willing to post bond for an employee accused of such a serious crime. Sarah considered it desperately, but she was a single mother of 3 working part-time at a medical office. She didn't have access to that kind of money either. Michael was remanded into custody. The reality of his situation crystallized in that moment. He was going to jail, not because he was guilty, but because he was poor and the machinery of the justice system had identified him as convenient. The charges filed were serious: vehicular assault with serious injury and leaving the scene of an accident. Conviction would mean up to 5 years in prison, 5 years away from his daughters, 5 years stolen from his life for a crime he didn't commit. As Michael was led from the courtroom, he caught Sarah's eye one last time. She was crying silently, and he was crying too, not in fear yet, but in the terrible realization of how quickly an innocent life could be destroyed by a system that cared more about closing cases than finding truth. He would spend the next 9 months in jail, waiting for trial, while his daughters grew up without their father and the real hit-and-run driver remained free. 9 months into Michael Torres' imprisonment, something shifted. David Reeves, the overworked public defender, finally caught a break. A colleague was reassigned to active duty, which meant Reeves inherited several of her cases. Among them was Michael Torres. It was a stroke of luck, the kind of chance circumstance that separates exoneration from wrongful conviction. Reeves was different from most of the other public defenders in the office. He was 54 years old, with 30 years of legal experience. He'd started his career in a prestigious law firm downtown, making good money defending wealthy clients against various charges. But somewhere along the way, he'd become disillusioned with that work. The cases felt hollow. The clients cared only about their bank accounts and reputations. After his daughter had been arrested for a non-violent drug offense, charges eventually dropped, Reeves had experienced a crisis of conscience. He'd quit the prestigious firm and joined the public defender's office, where he made half the salary but felt like he was actually making a difference. Reeves was known in the courthouse as meticulous, persistent, and occasionally infuriating to prosecutors, because he actually investigated his cases rather than simply processing them through the system. He was exactly the lawyer Michael needed, even if Michael didn't know it yet. Reeves began his investigation by reviewing the case file, not the prosecutor's condensed version, but the complete police reports, witness statements, and photographic evidence. What he found immediately troubled him. The police report mentioned surveillance footage from 2 nearby businesses, but only provided photographs of 1 traffic camera. The other cameras, the report stated, had inconclusive results and were not deemed relevant to the investigation. This phrase made Reeves's legal instincts flare. In his experience, inconclusive from police usually meant inconvenient. He obtained the surveillance footage from the 2 businesses himself, working through the proper legal channels and appealing to business managers who were sympathetic to an innocent man's plight. When he reviewed the footage, his breath caught. The second camera clearly showed a different red sedan at the accident scene, a different make, possibly a different model. Definitely not Michael's 2015 Accord. The vehicle in the footage appeared to be older, possibly with a different profile and different trim. Any person with basic car knowledge would recognize they were different vehicles. Reeves felt something between rage and vindication. This footage existed. It contradicted the prosecution's entire case, and it had been ignored by detective, either deliberately or through gross negligence. Either way, it was material, evidence favorable to the defendant that prosecutors are legally required to disclose. The fact that it hadn't been provided was itself a potential criminal violation. But Reeves knew better than to proceed emotionally. He documented everything meticulously. He contacted Michael at the county jail. "Michael, I have good news and complicated news," Reeves said through the jail phone system. Michael had learned not to trust good news in his 9 months inside, but he listened intently. "The surveillance footage shows a different vehicle at the accident scene, not your car. This footage was never presented to you or your previous attorney. This means the prosecution exculpatory evidence that proves your innocence. This is a serious breach of prosecutorial ethics and law." Michael's hands shook as he held the phone. "Does this mean I get out? Does this mean I'm free?" "It means we have grounds to challenge the case," Reeves said carefully. "But we still have to present it to the court. The prosecutors will likely argue they didn't think it was relevant, that they made an error in judgment. We'll need to prove intent or gross negligence. Either way, we have leverage now." Reeves reached out to Officer James next. Officer had been the first responder, had taken Emma's statement, and had worked the initial investigation before detective took over. Reeves knew that was the weakest link in his chain, the one person who might tell the truth if properly questioned. "Officer, I'm the public defender for Michael Torres. I wanted to ask you some questions about the investigation into the hit and run on Maple Street." His voice was guarded. "I provided all my information to detective. You'd have to speak with him about the case." "I understand," Reeves said, "but I'm asking specifically about your initial observations, about any concerns you may have had about the direction of the investigation." There was a long pause. "Mr. Reeves, I'm not comfortable discussing an ongoing case." "The case is ongoing because innocent evidence was suppressed," Reeves said bluntly. "I have surveillance footage showing a different vehicle at the accident scene, footage that was apparently deemed irrelevant by detective. I'm asking if you had concerns about this assessment." Another pause, longer this time, was wrestling with something, duty versus conscience, loyalty to the department versus truth. Finally, he spoke quietly. "I did have concerns. The second surveillance footage showed a vehicle that didn't match the description we were working with. I mentioned this to detective. He told me that the first vehicle identification was reliable and that we shouldn't let ambiguous footage cloud our focus. He said I should stick to protocol and not ask unnecessary questions. I was a junior officer. I followed his direction. But yes, I had concerns." Reeves felt the case solidifying. "Thank you, officer. That's very helpful. I may need you to provide a formal statement, possibly testimony." Paused. "Mr. Reeves, I need to know if Mr. Torres is actually innocent." "Officer, I believe he is, and I believe you do too." After hanging up, Reeves contacted a journalist named who worked for the Columbus Dispatch. He'd worked with her before on cases of potential injustice. He didn't provide her with specifics. He was careful about that. But he suggested she investigate the Torres case, particularly focusing on surveillance footage and how the initial investigation had been conducted. Was intrigued. She began her investigation, interviewing witnesses, accessing public records, and building a timeline. Within 2 weeks, her article appeared on the front page of the Dispatch. Man faces 5 years for crime he didn't commit, questions about hit-and-run investigation. The article was carefully written, avoiding accusations but raising serious questions. It mentioned the suppressed surveillance footage, quoted legal experts about violations, and presented Michael's background, his transformation, his stability, his role as a devoted father. It painted a picture of a man with everything to lose and nothing to gain from committing such a crime. The story went viral locally. It was picked up by Ohio news outlets, then regional news. True crime podcasters became interested. Social media erupted. Justice stores began trending. Suddenly, Michael Torres wasn't just a case number in a crowded courthouse. He was a symbol of potential injustice. The pressure intensified when published a follow-up article featuring an interview with Sarah Martinez. Sarah spoke about her ex-husband's transformation, her certainty of his innocence, and her devastation at watching an innocent man imprisoned. She spoke about their daughters, particularly Emma, and how the trauma of witnessing the accident had compounded the family's pain as they watched someone she knew to be innocent destroyed by the system. District Attorney's Office began receiving calls from concerned citizens, victim advocacy groups, and civil rights organizations. The department's handling of the case was being scrutinized. Pressure mounted on detective to justify his investigative decisions. Reeves used the media momentum strategically. He filed formal motions challenging the suppression of evidence and requesting bail reconsideration. He demanded that the surveillance footage be reviewed and officially entered into the discovery process. The judge, now aware of the media attention and the serious questions being raised, ordered a hearing on the violation. 9 months in jail had changed Michael. He was thinner, grayer, marked by the experience. But when Reeves met with him to prepare for the upcoming hearing, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in months: hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind that suffocates you with its fragility, but the kind grounded in evidence and legal process. "David, do you really think I'm getting out?" Michael asked. "I think we have a very strong case that you should never have been charged," Reeves replied. "I think the court is going to have to address serious violations of prosecutorial procedure, and I think justice, though late, is finally coming your way." Michael cried, not from weakness but from relief. The courtroom was packed to overflowing. By 8 o'clock on the first morning of trial, every seat was occupied. Reporters lined the back of the gallery, their notebooks ready. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse steps as attorneys arrived. The Torres case had become the defining story of the season, the potential injustice that had captured the public imagination. Justice Harrison, the presiding judge, had already ruled that media coverage would be permitted but controlled. No photographs inside the courtroom, no disruptions. Michael Torres sat at the defense table in a dark suit that hung slightly loose on his diminished frame. 9 months in county jail had stolen weight from him, clarity from his expression. He looked older than his 36 years, marked by the experience of wrongful imprisonment. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the table. Beside him, David Reeves was calm, organized, radiating confidence. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Victoria, sat at the table opposite. She was 42, sharp, ambitious. Unlike Detective, she hadn't been present during the suppressed evidence discovery. She'd taken over prosecution of the case after supervisor had reassigned it to her following the media attention. Victoria believed in the evidence as it had been presented to her. She believed in Detective's work. She would prosecute this case not out of malice, but out of sincere conviction that Michael Tors was guilty. She was, in many ways, a good prosecutor doing what she believed was her job. Judge Harrison took the bench at 9 o'clock sharp. He was 67, near retirement, with a reputation for fairness and a deep commitment to proper legal procedure. He'd already reviewed the motions, already noted the questions about suppressed evidence. He'd made clear that all relevant evidence would be admitted, and that this trial would proceed according to law, not convenience. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The state versus Michael Tors." The jury had been selected the previous week at 12 ordinary citizens and 4 alternates. A retired nurse, a high school teacher, 3 small business owners, a college student, a retired postal worker, and others. People with limited knowledge of the legal system, people who wanted to do the right thing, people who would depend on the attorneys to guide them through the complex dance of evidence and law. Victoria stood for opening statements. She was articulate and precise. She painted a picture of a man with a history of reckless driving who'd struck a cyclist and fled the scene. She presented the narrative simply: vehicle match, opportunity, motive, panic after hitting someone, and the partial license plate identification from the child witness. She emphasized that this was a straightforward case of someone who'd made a terrible decision and abandoned a human being on the street. "The evidence will show," she concluded, "that Michael Tors is responsible for this crime. It will show that he acted recklessly and without regard for another person's life. It will show that he fled the scene, leaving David, the injured cyclist, to suffer without aid. The law requires justice for that victim. That justice can only come through your verdict of guilty on all counts." David Reeves stood for the defense opening. He was calm, measured, and careful not to make promises he couldn't keep. He acknowledged that someone had committed this crime and that the victim deserved justice, but he questioned whether justice meant convicting an innocent man. "The evidence will show," Reeves said, looking directly at the jury, "that Michael Tors has been made convenient. His vehicle was similar to the suspect vehicle. He was alone at lunch. He had a past mistake, a DUI from 8 years ago that he's worked hard to overcome. The prosecution will ask you to build a conviction on convenience and circumstance. But our law is built on something deeper, the presumption of innocence and the demand that guilt be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. I ask you to listen carefully, to look beyond the easy narrative, and to demand real evidence. Real evidence that has not been hidden from you. Real evidence that proves guilt, not just possibility." The prosecution's case began to unfold. The first witness was the officer who'd responded to Emma's 911 call. He about the scene, the cyclist's injuries, the description of the vehicle. Nothing controversial, nothing that contradicted what everyone already knew. Then Detective took the stand. Was confident, authoritative, dressed in his dress uniform with his detective's badge prominently displayed. He about the traffic camera footage showing a red sedan heading away from the scene. He about running the license plate and identifying Michael Tors. He about the vehicle match, about Michael's lack of alibi during the critical time period, about the DUI from years past as evidence of reckless character. Under Victoria's questioning, the narrative seemed solid, compelling, inevitable. But when Reeves began his cross-examination, the ground shifted slightly. Reeves asked about the second surveillance footage, the footage that had been deemed inconclusive. "Detective, I'm directing your attention to the surveillance footage from the business located at 427 Maple Street, recorded at 3:15 p.m. on March 19th. Have you reviewed this footage?" "I reviewed it briefly," admitted. "The quality was poor, the image was unclear." "Was it so unclear that you could not distinguish between a 2015 Accord and other red sedan models?" "It was difficult to distinguish specific vehicle features," replied carefully. "So difficult that you decided not to include it in your investigation." "We had other evidence that was more reliable." Reeves let that answer hang in the air. Did you share this footage with the defendant's original attorney? It was included in the discovery materials. Is that yes or no, detective? Was this specific footage shared with the defense? Hesitated. My understanding is that all discovery materials were provided. That's not what I asked. Was this specific footage provided to the defense attorney? I don't recall specifically. Detective, is it true that you ordered officers not to pursue questions about this second surveillance footage? I did not order anything of the sort. I directed them to focus on the evidence that was most promising. Most promising to you, or most promising to reaching a quick conclusion? Reeves didn't wait for an answer. No further questions at this time. The jury watched this exchange carefully. They were beginning to sense that something wasn't clean about the investigation. Then Emma took the stand. At 8 years old, Emma looked tiny in the witness box. She wore a white dress Sarah had chosen carefully, trying to make her daughter look innocent and sympathetic. Emma was nervous, intimidated by the formality of the courtroom and the attention of so many adult strangers. Her voice was small. Victoria questioned her gently, asking her to describe what she'd seen on the afternoon of March 19th. Emma that she'd seen a red car going very fast, that it had hit the man on the bike, that the car had driven away without stopping. She that she'd seen part of the license plate. Did you get a clear look at the driver? Victoria asked. No, Emma said. The window was like foggy from the rain. But you saw the car clearly. Yes, the car was red. It was going really fast. Emma is the person who was driving that car in this courtroom today. Emma looked around the room, confused by the question. Finally, her gaze landed on Michael Tors. Hesitantly, she pointed. I think, maybe that one. But even as she pointed, her voice wavered with uncertainty. The jury noticed. A child's memory, traumatized by what she'd witnessed, was not as reliable as the prosecution had hoped. During cross-examination, Reeves was gentle but thorough. Emma, when you saw the car, did you see the driver's face clearly? No, the window was all foggy. So you couldn't see if the driver was a man or a woman? I don't know, it was like a person shape. And you said there were multiple red cars like this one. I don't know. Mama has a red car. My friend's grandmother has a red car. The jury was beginning to understand that Emma's identification, while genuine, was not conclusive. Then Victoria called Officer James to the stand, and with him came K9 Duke. Duke trotted into the courtroom in his handler's harness, alert and focused. The prosecution had strategically timed this. They wanted Duke in the courtroom, wanted the jury to see the professional K9 unit, wanted to use the dog's presence as implicit evidence that the investigation had been thorough and professional. Officer, Victoria began, can you explain your role in this investigation? K9 Duke and I were called to the scene to assist in evidence tracking and accident reconstruction. Duke was trained to follow scent trails and to identify evidence that human investigators might miss. His participation in any investigation ensures that we maintain the highest standards of thorough, professional investigation. It was a carefully prepared answer, designed to emphasize professionalism and make the jury feel that the investigation had been complete and competent. But the jury didn't know what Officer knew, that he'd expressed doubts about the investigation, doubts that had been dismissed. They didn't know that David Reeves had something waiting for them. They didn't know that the evidence they were being presented was incomplete, that crucial information had been hidden from them. As the first day of trial concluded and the jury was dismissed, the momentum seemed to favor the prosecution. Michael Tors sat with his head slightly bowed, aware that the narrative was being built against him, aware that his liberty hung in the balance. The second day of trial began with Michael Tors still carrying the weight of yesterday's testimony. The prosecution had painted a compelling picture. The jury seemed sympathetic to the narrative of a reckless man who'd committed a terrible crime. But David Reeves knew something they didn't. He had a bomb to detonate, and he was about to light the fuse. Reeves called Officer James to the stand as a defense witness, not as a prosecution witness, but as a defense witness. This was unexpected. The judge raised an eyebrow. Victoria objected, but Judge Harrison overruled her. Officer was a relevant witness, and the defense had the right to question him. Officer took the stand reluctantly. He was a young officer, 32, with 12 years of service. He wore his uniform and his bearing was professional, but his eyes revealed his internal conflict. He'd known this day was coming. He'd spent the previous weeks wrestling with his conscience. Officer Reeves began. You responded to the scene of the hit-and-run on March 19th. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And as part of the initial investigation, you took a statement from the child witness, Emma Martinez. Is that correct? Yes. In your professional experience as a law enforcement officer, how would you characterize Ms. Martinez's ability to provide a definitive identification? She was traumatized, Officer said carefully. She just witnessed a serious accident. She was understandably shaken. Her identification was based on a vehicle that was partially obscured by rain on a window. I noted in my report that her identification should be corroborated by other evidence before drawing firm conclusions. Victoria shifted uncomfortably at the prosecution table. Officer, when you were at the scene, did you review surveillance footage from surrounding businesses? Yes, we received footage from 2 nearby business security systems. Did you review both sets of footage? I did. What was your assessment of that footage? Officer took a deep breath. This was the moment where his career could be impacted, where his loyalty to the department would be tested against his loyalty to justice. The second surveillance footage showed a vehicle that didn't match the description provided by the child witness, said quietly. The vehicle appeared to be a different model and possibly a different year than the suspect vehicle. The color was similar, red, but the overall profile and dimensions seemed different. Did you discuss this discrepancy with Detective? I did. I expressed my concern that we might be pursuing the wrong vehicle. What was Detective's response? Officer hesitated. He glanced toward Detective, who was seated in the courtroom gallery, watching this testimony with an expression that moved from curiosity to anger. Detective told me that the first identification was more reliable and that I should focus my investigation accordingly. He said I shouldn't let peripheral evidence distract from the main investigation. Did he order you not to pursue the question of the second surveillance footage? Not directly, but the message was clear. I was a junior officer. I didn't feel I had the authority to challenge his direction. Reeves nodded slowly, letting the testimony settle with the jury. No further questions. Victoria stood for cross-examination, her expression sharp. Officer, is it possible that you misread the surveillance footage? That what you thought was a different vehicle was actually the same vehicle at a different angle or under different lighting conditions? It's theoretically possible, admitted. But in my professional training, vehicles can be distinguished by several consistent features: the roofline, the window dimensions, the overall length-to-width ratio. Those features appear different to me. But you're not an automotive expert. No, but I'm trained in scene investigation. And Detective is also trained in scene investigation, correct? He is. And he reached a different conclusion than you. He did. Victoria sat down, not satisfied but unable to impeach the officer's testimony without appearing to attack him. The jury was watching closely now. Then came the moment. David Reeves stood and requested that surveillance footage be displayed. He approached Judge Harrison with the recordings on USB drives. He'd already provided copies to the prosecution, who'd examined them and raised no objection to their admission. They had no grounds to object. The evidence was what it was. "Your Honor," Reeves said, "I would like to present surveillance video from 427 Maple Street, recorded on March 19th at 3:15 p.m. Judge Harrison nodded. The courtroom's screens flickered to life. What appeared on those screens was the footage that should have been shown to the jury from the beginning. It clearly showed a red sedan at the accident scene, a sedan that bore no resemblance to Michael Torr's 2015 Accord. The vehicle in the footage was older, possibly a 2005 or earlier or similar model. The shape was distinctly different. The victim cyclist was struck by this vehicle, thrown over its hood, crashed onto the pavement. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Harrison pounded his gavel once, a warning, but the damage was done. The jury had seen what should have been seen from the beginning. Victoria stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I object. This footage was not properly disclosed to the prosecution." "Assistant District Attorney," Judge Harrison said coldly, "this footage was included in the discovery materials provided by Detectives Department. If it was not forwarded to your office, that is a matter to be addressed elsewhere. But it is clearly relevant, clearly exculpatory, and it is being admitted. Continue, Mr. Reeves." Reeves played the footage again, this time pausing at key moments. He pointed out the differences between this vehicle and Michael's. He highlighted the license plate, which was not fully visible but which bore no resemblance to Michael's plate. He showed the footage at normal speed, then at slow motion, letting the jury absorb the reality of what they were seeing. Then he played the footage one more time while the cyclist, David, sat in the gallery. As watched himself being struck by the vehicle, his face changed. He'd never seen this footage. He'd been shown photographs of Michael's vehicle and had indicated it was similar to what he remembered, but he'd never seen actual video footage of the collision. Now, watching it, his expression transformed from confusion to recognition. Not recognition of Michael's involvement, but recognition of his own error in identification. When the video ended, looked directly at Michael Torrs and shook his head, a subtle gesture but one the jury couldn't miss. It was the gesture of someone realizing they'd been wrong, that they'd identified the wrong man. Officer was recalled to the stand. "Officer, having reviewed this surveillance footage again in court, would you revise your professional opinion regarding the discrepancy between this vehicle and the suspect vehicle, identified by detective?" "Yes," officer said firmly. "Those are clearly different vehicles. The first vehicle, the one in this footage, is what struck the cyclist. Michael Torr's vehicle does not match. I should have been more forceful in raising this issue." Victoria had no questions for officer on recross. There was nothing to ask. The evidence was the evidence. The momentum in the courtroom had shifted completely. The jury's faces showed confusion, doubt, growing realization that they'd been led toward an incorrect conclusion. Michael Torrs sat at the defense table, and for the first time since his arrest, he allowed himself to believe that innocence might actually matter, that truth might actually prevail. Judge Harrison looked troubled. He'd overseen many trials, and he recognized the smell of prosecutorial misconduct. He called Reeves and Victoria to approach the bench, out of the jury's hearing. "We will have a hearing regarding the suppression of evidence," the judge said quietly but with clear authority. "That will take place after the jury verdict, but I want both of you to understand something. If it is determined that this evidence was deliberately, there will be consequences. Serious consequences." He looked at Victoria. "You need to investigate how your discovery materials were prepared. This footage should have been in your file." Then he turned to Reeves. "You've made your point. Do not overplay your hand. Let the evidence speak." As the afternoon session began, the prosecution's case was visibly weakened. The jury had seen the contradiction. They had heard officer express doubt. They had watched the actual surveillance footage showing a different vehicle. The narrative of Michael Torr's guilt, which had seemed so solid yesterday, was now fractured. Michael Torres caught Sarah's eye from across the courtroom. They didn't smile. It was too serious for that, but something passed between them, a moment of shared understanding that justice might still be possible. As the day ended and the jury was excused, the gallery erupted in conversation. Reporters scrambled to update their stories. The case had turned. Everyone could feel it. The second day of trial had been devastating for the prosecution. Victoria spent the evening reviewing her files, trying to understand how the surveillance footage had been categorized as inconclusive in the discovery materials. She found a note in detective's handwriting. Secondary footage examined. Vehicle profile differs but image quality insufficient for definitive identification. Recommend focus on primary evidence stream. The note was dated 2 weeks after the accident. It was professional judgment call. But now, after seeing the footage in court, it appeared to be selective reasoning designed to fit a predetermined conclusion. Victoria was troubled. She still believed in the justice system, but she was beginning to question whether her faith was warranted. She'd been handed a case, told it was solid, and she'd prosecuted it accordingly. Now she was wondering how many innocent people might be sitting in prison because prosecutors trusted detectives without asking hard questions. The third day of trial began with Emma Martinez's mother testifying briefly. Sarah described her ex-husband's stable life, his devotion to his daughters, his complete transformation over the years. She spoke about the night of the accident, about Emma's trauma, about her own anguish at watching someone she knew to be good imprisoned for a crime she believed he didn't commit. The jury listened sympathetically, but seemed to be waiting for the next bombshell. They sensed something was coming. Reeves was orchestrating his case carefully, building momentum, letting the jury absorb each revelation. He called a forensic expert to the stand, Dr. Williams, an accident reconstruction specialist with 25 years of experience. Dr. Williams had been hired by Reeves to examine the accident scene and analyze whether the damage patterns were consistent with Michael's vehicle or the vehicle shown in the surveillance footage. Dr. Williams, Reeves asked, based on your analysis of the accident scene photographs, the victim's injuries and the debris patterns, what can you conclude about the vehicle that struck David? Dr. Williams had prepared a detailed presentation. She displayed photographs and diagrams showing impact angles, damage patterns, and the trajectory of the victim's body as it flew over the hood. She pointed out specific details, the height at which impact occurred, the probable roof height of the striking vehicle, the wheelbase dimensions suggested by the tire marks left at the scene. Based on this analysis, Dr. Williams concluded, the striking vehicle is consistent with a compact sedan, likely a Civic or similar model from the 1990s or early 2000s. The impact height and angle are inconsistent with a 2015 Accord, which has a higher profile and different dimensions. The victim would have been struck at a different height, and the impact pattern would have left different marks on the pavement. In my professional opinion, Michael Torres' vehicle could not have caused the injuries sustained by the victim. Victoria had no expert to counter this testimony. She had no vehicle expert prepared. The prosecution had assumed the case was airtight enough that such detailed analysis wouldn't be necessary. Now they were paying the price for that assumption. But the most dramatic moment was still to come. As Dr. Williams stepped down from the stand, the courtroom doors opened. A woman in her mid-50s entered, escorted by a security guard. The woman was visibly nervous, clutching a manila envelope against her chest. The bailiff whispered something to Judge Harrison, who nodded and gestured the woman forward. "Your Honor," Reeves said, standing, "the defense calls." Victoria's face showed confusion. She checked her witness list, was not on any list. She had no idea who this woman was or what she might testify about. Took the oath and sat in the witness box, her hands trembling slightly. She'd been working herself up to come to court for 3 days, wrestling with her conscience, trying to decide if it was her responsibility. Finally, after seeing news reports about the case, Seeing Michael Torr's face on television, she'd made the decision. Ms. Reeves began gently. "What is your occupation?" "I'm a security manager for Garage, located at 429 Maple Street, approximately 2 blocks from where the hit-and-run occurred." The gallery stirred. Reeves had found a new witness, someone with evidence. "On March 19th, were you working at the Garage?" I was in the office handling administrative work." "Does your garage have security camera systems?" "Yes, multiple cameras covering the entrance, the parking levels, and the surrounding area." "Did those cameras capture footage on March 19th?" "They did. I reviewed the footage that day, and I found something unusual." "What did you find?" Opened the manila envelope and removed a USB drive with a slightly shaking hand. "I found footage of a vehicle entering the garage at 3:23 p.m. on March 19th, approximately 3 minutes after the accident. The vehicle was a red sedan, but it wasn't in good condition. There was damage to the front end. The hood was crumpled. There was a large dent in the windshield, the kind you'd get if someone had been thrown against it. The vehicle had hit something very hard very recently." The courtroom went silent. Reeves gestured toward the technician who loaded the USB drive. Footage appeared on the courtroom screens. It showed a battered red vehicle entering a parking garage. The damage was unmistakable: a human-sized dent in the hood, cracks in the windshield from impact, damaged bumper, paint scraped away. This was a vehicle that had just struck someone at high speed. Ms. Reeves continued, "Did you report this footage to police?" "I called the non-emergency line the day after the accident. I explained what I'd found and described the vehicle. The dispatcher took my information and said an officer would contact me, but no one ever did. I called again a week later. Still no response. I didn't have the vehicle owner's information. The garage had different parking levels, and I didn't have a complete list of who parked where. I thought maybe they'd follow up on their own, but I never heard anything. I decided I'd keep the footage, just in case." "You kept this footage for 9 months without releasing it." "I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't sure if it was my responsibility or if the police already knew about it. I only came forward when I saw the news stories about the case, about the man who might go to prison. I realized that the police might not know about my footage. I knew I had to come forward." Reeves nodded. "Thank you, Ms. No further questions." Victoria stood for cross-examination, her mind racing. She had to challenge this testimony somehow, but there was no logical way to do so. The woman was credible, her story was straightforward, and the footage was tangible evidence. "Ms., are you certain that this footage was recorded on March 19th? The timestamp on the video clearly shows the date and time. March 19th at 3:23 p.m. And you never reported this vehicle to police other than the non-emergency line call?" "That's correct. I assumed someone from the police would follow up." "No further questions," Victoria said, sitting down in defeat. Judge Harrison looked gravely concerned. He called another bench conference. "Mr. Reeves, how is it that a crucial piece of evidence was not discovered during the police investigation?" "Your Honor, that's a question that should be answered by Detective and his department." The judge turned to Victoria. "Did your office conduct any independent investigation into the hit-and-run? Any effort to canvass businesses near the accident scene?" "Your Honor, we relied on the police investigation. The police assured us they'd been thorough." "It appears they were not." Judge Harrison's voice was cold. "The evidence of prosecutorial misconduct is mounting. I want the defendant's original statement on the record regarding whether the surveillance video and the witness testimony were ever disclosed to him or his original counsel." Michael Torres was called to testify. He spoke about his arrest, his bail hearing, his 9 months in jail. He confirmed that he'd never been shown surveillance footage from the parking garage. He confirmed that had never been identified to him or his original counsel as a potential witness. As Michael stepped down, Victoria knew that her case was dead. She had no witnesses left to call that would matter. The evidence was overwhelming now. Not only had the prosecution pursued the wrong man, but they'd done so while ignoring evidence that pointed toward a different perpetrator entirely. During the afternoon recess, the parking garage footage went viral on social media. Justice Tours exploded again with new energy. News outlets ran the story with banner headlines. Crucial evidence ignored 49 MONTHS. Accused man may be completely innocent. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Civil rights attorneys called for an investigation into Detective. The district attorney's office began damage control, issuing statements about how they took prosecutorial misconduct seriously. Michael Tours sat in a holding cell during the recess, barely believing what was happening. His attorney, David Reeves, visited him briefly. "Michael, the case is essentially over. The prosecution's narrative has completely collapsed. We have definitive evidence of a different vehicle. We have an expert confirming inconsistencies, and we now have a witness with footage of that vehicle damaged immediately after the accident. Unless something extraordinary happens, you will be acquitted." Michael wept, not from joy yet, but from the overwhelming relief of seeing innocence might finally be recognized by the system that had tried to destroy him. The final day of trial arrived heavy with inevitability. The prosecution's case had been systematically dismantled. Victoria had no remaining witnesses who could meaningfully counter the evidence of Michael's innocence. She could have rested, could have simply let the trial proceed to closing arguments, but she felt obligated to make one final effort. She called Detective back to the stand, a last attempt to have him explain the suppressed evidence, to provide context that might mitigate the appearance of misconduct. But her questions fell flat. His testimony only deepened the appearance of selective investigation. He explained his reasoning for focusing on Michael Tours, the similar vehicle, the lack of alibi, the prior DUI, but he couldn't explain why evidence contradicting his theory had been dismissed as inconclusive. He couldn't explain why garage footage had been ignored. "Detective," Victoria asked carefully, "did you intentionally suppress evidence that contradicted your theory of the case?" "No," said. "I prioritized the evidence that seemed most reliable. That's basic investigative protocol. You focus on the strongest leads." "But shouldn't all relevant evidence be presented to the defense?" "All discovered evidence is presented. I didn't discover the parking garage footage. That wasn't my responsibility." Reeves stood. "Detective, the parking garage is 2 blocks from the accident scene. Did you canvass all businesses in a 2-block radius?" "We canvassed the immediate area." "Did that include the parking garage?" Hesitated. "I don't recall every location we contacted." "So you don't know if your department contacted them or not?" "I'm saying it's possible we did and they didn't respond, or we didn't. It's been 9 months. I don't have a detailed log." The answer hung in the air like an indictment. A detective who didn't know if he'd done basic investigative work. The jury was not impressed. Victoria rested the prosecution's case. She had no more witnesses. She had no more evidence to present. Judge Harrison called a recess. He informed the attorneys that he was considering declaring a mistrial based on prosecutorial misconduct. He wanted to give both sides an opportunity to present arguments on the record about what should happen next. But before closing arguments, David Reeves had one final witness to call. He'd planned this carefully, had been waiting for the right moment, and now, with the prosecution's case in ruins and the jury's mind open, was the perfect time. "Your Honor, the defense calls Tours." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Was 3 years old, barely old enough to understand what a courtroom was, certainly too young to provide legal testimony in any traditional sense. But Reeves had something specific in mind. Sarah brought into the courtroom. The toddler was dressed in a simple blue dress, her dark hair in pigtails, her small face curious and confused by the formal surroundings. She clung to her mother's hand, uncertain about this strange place with so many people watching her. Victoria stood immediately. "Your Honor, I object. A 3-year-old cannot provide competent testimony." "Your Honor," Reeves responded, "I'm not asking for testimony in the traditional sense. I'm asking to present evidence through a visual identification exercise. The child is simply being asked to point at photographs. It's no different than the court allowing a child to identify a suspect in a lineup, which is standard practice." Judge Harrison considered this. He looked then at Sarah, then at Reeves. "Mr. Reeves, what exactly are you proposing?" "Your Honor, I'm proposing a simple visual comparison. The child will be shown 2 photographs, one of Michael Torr's vehicle and one of the vehicle identified in the surveillance footage from the parking garage. I'm not asking her to testify about the accident or anything she witnessed. I'm simply asking her to identify which photograph matches the vehicle shown in the surveillance footage." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "Very well, but keep this brief. And the jury must understand that this is supplementary to the expert testimony already presented, not substituting for that testimony." Was brought to the front of the courtroom. She looked impossibly small, dwarfed by the judge's bench, the witness stand, the formal furniture of the courtroom. Sarah stood nearby, close enough to provide comfort. Reeves had 2 photographs prepared. One of Michael's red Accord, taken from a professional angle in a parking lot, and one of the damaged red sedan from the parking garage footage, the damage clearly visible, the deformation unmistakable. Reeves said gently, kneeling down to be at eye level with the child, "I'm going to show you 2 pictures. I want you to point at the car that hit the man on the bike." "Okay." Nodded, her attention focused on the colorful photographs. Reeves showed her the first photo, the well-maintained Accord. "Is this the car?" Studied it for a moment, then shook her head. "No." Reeves showed her the second photograph, the damaged vehicle. His face changed immediately. Her eyes widened with recognition. "This one," said clearly, pointing at the damaged vehicle. "This one is bad, it hurt the man." The courtroom held its breath. Even at 3 years old, even without understanding the legal proceedings, had recognized the vehicle from the surveillance footage. More than that, she'd recognized it as the car that had caused harm. But then something extraordinary happened. As turned from the photograph, she saw Officer James sitting in the courtroom, and beside him was K9 Duke in his handler's harness. The police dogs alert, intelligent eyes were watching the courtroom proceedings with the focused awareness that trained dogs possessed. Pointed at Duke, her face brightening. "Good dog," she said simply, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "He knows, good dog know." The words hung in the air and their significance struck everyone simultaneously. A 3-year-old child, in her innocence and inability to lie or deceive, had made a profound statement. The good dog Duke, the symbol of professional law enforcement, knows. The dog knows the truth. Dogs don't lie. Dogs don't protect corrupt investigations. Dogs simply know. The jury was watching Duke, watching Officer, and the truth of the moment overwhelmed them. This wasn't a legal argument. This wasn't a prosecutor's narrative or a detective's theory. This was an innocent child recognizing the car that had caused harm, and then acknowledging the integrity represented by the police dog, the symbol of an investigation conducted with honesty and care. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Michael Torres, sitting at the defense table, put his face in his hands and wept openly. Even Victoria appeared shaken, understanding in that moment that her pursuit of this case, however sincere, had been wrong. Judge Harrison's expression was one of profound emotion. He looked at the jury, and in their faces he saw understanding. Not just intellectual understanding of the evidence, but emotional, moral understanding that this young man had been wronged, that an innocent life had been destroyed by a system that had failed him, and that truth, simple, unvarnished truth, had finally spoken. "The court recognizes the profound importance of this moment," Judge Harrison said quietly. "However, I must note that while this demonstration is emotionally significant, it is the expert testimony, the surveillance footage, and the physical evidence that constitute the legal foundation for understanding this case. The jury is instructed to base their verdict on the totality of evidence presented, not on any single element." But everyone in the courtroom knew that something had fundamentally shifted. The case was over. Michael Torres would be acquitted. The machinery of justice, which had nearly destroyed an innocent man, was finally recognizing its error. Reeves gathered in his arms and carried her from the witness area. The child looked confused about why everyone was looking at her, why some people were crying, why the room felt so heavy with emotion. She'd simply pointed at a picture and noticed a nice dog. She didn't understand the significance of what she'd done. But the courtroom understood. The jury understood. The judge understood. And as Judge Harrison called for a recess before closing arguments, it was obvious to everyone that the outcome of this trial was predetermined. The only question left was not whether Michael would be acquitted, but how quickly that acquittal would come. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. 3 hours for 12 ordinary citizens to review the evidence, discuss what they'd heard, and reach a verdict on a case that had become national news. 3 hours to undo 9 months of wrongful imprisonment, to reverse a trajectory toward a 5-year prison sentence, to acknowledge that an innocent man had been on trial for a crime someone else had committed. Michael Torres sat in a holding cell, unable to eat, unable to sleep. His attorney, David Reeves, sat beside him, radiating calm confidence. "It's done," Reeves said. "The verdict is already decided. We're just waiting for the formality." When the jury returned, their faces told the story. They looked troubled, sad even, not the expression of jurors who'd convicted someone, but the expression of jurors who'd been forced to confront a system's failure. The verdict was unanimous, not guilty on all counts. Not guilty of vehicular assault, not guilty of leaving the scene of an accident, completely exonerated, completely acquitted, not just reasonable doubt but complete vindication. The courtroom erupted. Sarah screamed, a release of 9 months of anguish. Emma and embraced their mother, crying from relief. Too young to understand, simply watched the adults around her with confusion. Judge Harrison gavelled for order, but even he seemed to be fighting back emotion. Michael Torres collapsed into David Reeves's arms, weeping with the kind of relief that only the wrongly imprisoned understand. His life had been stolen, 9 months, his reputation destroyed, his daughter's childhood marked by their father's absence and the stain of false accusation. But now he was free. Not just legally free, but with the complete vindication that only a not guilty verdict could provide. Victoria stood and approached Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, on behalf of the state, I apologize to Michael Torres for the prosecution's role in this case. The evidence presented shows serious failures in the police investigation, including the suppression of exculpatory evidence. We recognize that an innocent man was brought to trial, and we take full responsibility for not identifying these failures before proceeding." It was an extraordinary statement, a public acknowledgement by the prosecution that they had participated in injustice. Judge Harrison nodded gravely. The court accepts this acknowledgement. However, there are matters beyond the jury's verdict that must be addressed. Detectives' handling of this investigation will be subject to immediate review by the police department and the district attorney's office. The violation, the withholding of exculpatory evidence, constitutes potential criminal conduct by a law enforcement officer. That matter will be referred for investigation. Within 48 hours, Detective was suspended pending investigation. His career, built on closing cases quickly, had ended in disgrace. The investigation revealed a pattern, had been under pressure to close cases, and in his ambition, he'd let that pressure override investigative integrity. There would be consequences. Officer James' statement to the jury had been scrutinized carefully by Internal Affairs. Initially, there were concerns that had breached loyalty to the department, but as the investigation into his conduct deepened, emerged as an officer who'd had the moral courage to tell the truth under oath, despite pressure to stay silent. Within a week, Officer was reassigned to the police department's Internal Investigation Unit, tasked with investigating corruption and misconduct within the department itself. He would become an advocate for transparency and accountability, the exact opposite of what had represented. K9 Duke remained a symbol of integrity, his image circulating through social media as the embodiment of truth and loyalty. Dog training centers across the country began using Duke's story in their materials about ethical policing. The dog had done nothing except sit beside his handler, but his presence at that trial would be remembered as emblematic of proper law enforcement. David Reeves received recognition that transcended normal legal practice. The Ohio State Bar Association awarded him the prestigious Harrison Award for Excellence in Public Defense. His name was entered into consideration for the American Bar Association's Award for Public Service. Law schools invited him to speak about the Torres case and the importance of thorough investigation. His career, which had seemed stalled in the underfunded public defender's office, had been transformed. But more importantly, he'd proven that one dedicated attorney could make a difference, that the system, despite its flaws, could still deliver justice when someone refused to accept convenient lies. Sarah Martinez agreed to an exclusive interview with. The story ran as the cover feature of the Columbus Dispatch. A family's ordeal, how wrongful prosecution nearly destroyed a father's life and his children's future. Sarah spoke about her initial doubt, her growing conviction of Michael's innocence, her support during the trial, and her devastation at what the system had done to someone she knew to be good. The article became one of the most read pieces the Dispatch had ever published. The real hit-and-run driver was identified within 2 weeks through the parking garage footage. He was a 58-year-old man named Robert who'd been fleeing the scene in his damaged 2003, had a suspended license, no insurance, and was wanted for failure to pay child support. He'd panicked at hitting the cyclist and fled. He was arrested, charged with vehicular assault and leaving the scene of an accident, and subsequently convicted. He received a sentence of 2 years, with an additional year for the suspended license and other violations. Justice, true justice, came to bear on the person who'd actually committed the crime. Michael Torres was released from custody with a $500,000 settlement from the city of Columbus for wrongful prosecution. It wasn't enough to compensate for what he'd lost, the 9 months stolen, the damage to his reputation, the trauma to his daughters, but it represented the city's acknowledgement of error and their commitment to making restitution. Michael used part of the settlement to hire a private investigator to document everything that had gone wrong in the investigation. He wanted to prevent this from happening to someone else. The reunion of Michael with his daughters was captured by news helicopters hovering over a park where the family had agreed to meet. Emma ran to her father and held him, crying with the intensity of a child who'd been separated from her parent by forces beyond her comprehension, embraced him carefully, as if afraid he might disappear again. Even, too young to fully understand where her father had been, seemed to sense his importance and clung to him. Sarah stood apart, watching, her own tears flowing. When Michael turned to her, they embraced, not as husband and wife, but as two people bound by shared trauma and shared relief that it was finally over. "Thank you," Michael said simply, "for believing in me, for fighting for me." "Thank you for being innocent," Sarah replied. "Thank you for not giving up, even when it seemed impossible." Judge Harrison ordered a comprehensive review of the police department's procedures for handling evidence. New protocols were implemented requiring that all discovered evidence, whether deemed conclusive or inconclusive, be disclosed to the defense. Regular audits would verify compliance. The case became the basis for a statewide initiative to prevent prosecutorial misconduct. 6 months after acquittal, David Reeves met with one more time. She asked him if he believed Michael Torr's case was unique or if it represented a broader systemic failure. "I think," Reeves said carefully, "that Michael's case is unique in how it was resolved. An innocent man found vindication, public acknowledgement of error, and the real perpetrator was identified. But I think the dynamics that led to his prosecution, the pressure to close cases, the tunnel vision of investigators, the failures of prosecution oversight, are not unique. I fear there are dozens of Michael sitting in prisons right now, having had the misfortune of being convenient when the system needed a solution." His words would become the foundation for what became known as the Torr's Initiative, a nationwide program to review cold cases and potentially wrongful convictions, particularly those involving confessions or identifications that seemed questionable. The case that had nearly destroyed Michael Torr's became, instead, the catalyst for systemic reform. Michael Torr's returned to his job in construction, but he also became an advocate. He spoke at bar associations about his experience. He participated in panels with prosecutors, police, and defense attorneys. He became the human face of wrongful prosecution, not an abstract concept, but a real man whose life had been nearly destroyed and who'd been lucky enough to have the evidence, the advocate, and the courage to prevail. Emma, who'd been traumatized by witnessing the accident, began working with child psychologists to process her experience. She would eventually become an advocate for child witness protection and proper interview protocols for children who'd witnessed trauma. Her childhood had been stolen by accident and injustice, but she transformed that pain into purpose. Sarah reflected often on the case and what it meant. "Justice," she told an interviewer, "almost didn't happen. We were one lucky detective reassignment away from Michael spending 5 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. We were one parking garage manager away from crucial evidence being lost forever. We were one journalist away from the story never being told. Justice didn't prevail because the system worked. Justice prevailed because individuals, David Reeves, officer, chose to pursue truth over convenience. That terrifies me. It means the system is fragile. It means innocent people are probably in prison right now because they didn't have someone willing to fight for them. That's what I'll never forget." The Torr's case became required reading in law schools, required viewing in police academy training programs, required study in criminal justice reform initiatives. It was the story of a system failing, but then, through the grace of individual character and determination, somehow delivering justice anyway. Michael Torr's would spend the rest of his life grateful for each day of freedom with his daughters, grateful for the lawyers and witnesses who'd saved him, and haunted by the realization that he'd nearly lost everything to a system that claimed to exist for justice, but had nearly destroyed him instead.